please start by telling us who you are, where you're from, and a little bit about your community.
So my name is Samantha Sencer-Mura. I am the representative-elect for District 63A, which is South Minneapolis. It's actually the district that I grew up in. I've lived there most of my life. So we have a large chunk of South Minneapolis. We have some, more retail areas, more kind of highly densely areas. We have part of Franklin Avenue and part of Lake Street, which are pretty big streets in Minneapolis that a lot of folks know. We have a large chunk of the Mississippi River. And then we also, have a lot of residential areas, a lot of families as well. So it's a community made up of a lot of families, made up of people of different races, different religions, different ages. A lot of folks who really appreciate both like what the city has to offer, but also all of the great nature that you have access to in Minneapolis. It's also, an area that was really deeply changed by the events of 2020. The murder of George Floyd was very close to the district that I'm now representing, and a lot of, the uprising, the protests were centered around Lake Street, which, encompasses my district. So I think that there's, a lot of folks in my community who are still feeling that trauma coming out of 2020, still deeply engaged in the issues of racial justice, rethinking public safety. And there's a lot of kind of rebuilding and healing that still needs to happen in the community I'm representing.
So is that what you heard a lot when you were door knocking or in events in terms of what your constituents wanted to see addressed here at the Capitol when things start next month?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a huge issue. I think the events of 2020 changed a lot of people, right? There was a lot of communities coming together, a lot of people banding together, a lot of resilience. But in the years since then, I think there's also a lot of questions of, okay, how do we take some of the energy that we felt, the energy we were feeling in our community, the calls for change, and how do we actually turn that into policy, right? And I think that's the place where the city of Minneapolis is. And I think that's, something that folks in my district are really looking for the state to step up on as well, right? How do we make some serious gains around issues of racial justice? We had a lot of conversations, a lot of talk in 2020, but I think, people are wanting to see that turn into action. Something else I heard a lot about on the doors was just education. And how are we supporting the young folks in our community with just the incredibly hard few years they've been through with, being out of school, COVID, learning loss, all of the kind of emotional turmoil that comes with that, a lot of, instability that our students and families have been facing. And then, on top of that, our young people in the community were also there, watching the murder of George Floyd unfold, watching, the events since then. And a lot of young people in our community are really, looking for a government to step up and deliver something different. I would say, particularly around the issue of education, I was door knocking a lot last spring when the Minneapolis Public Schools was on strike. So we had, teachers, students out of the classroom for 3 weeks in the midst of, an incredibly hard year, in the midst of incredibly hard couple years where our students have just had so much instability. And so during that time, I heard a lot from people because it came out, the surplus number kind of came out right around the same time as that strike. And so a lot of questions of, okay, I want to support the teachers. I look at their demands. I think the demands are really reasonable. They're asking for the supports that our students need. They're asking for a livable wage. I want to support that. I'm also really concerned about my students being out of the classroom. And how is that happening at the same time that our state has, I think it was then, a $9 billion surplus, right? Like, how am I hearing that, we don't have enough, but yet at the state level, it seems like we have a lot. And so where's that, disconnect between kind of the abundance of resources that the state is having and, how that's actually trickling down to our communities? That was a big concern that I heard.
I was reading your campaign page, and obviously quality education is very meaningful to you. But what needs to happen for us to get there?
Yeah. I've had a lot of conversations about this on the campaign trail, both with, students, families, how it's affecting their day-to-day lives, but also, trying to understand more from the policy perspective. I come from a more direct service background, so I've been working directly with students and families in schools, and so as I move to the state level, I'm kind of trying to understand more of the structural system. And all of the smartest people I talked to, all the people who have been doing this work for a long time, just talked about funding, right? And the reality that we are funding schools, we're funding students at, much less than we used to. And, at a time where we know the needs are so great. We just really need to be stepping up, so fully funded schools, fully funded public schools is a big thing that I care about. I think there's going to be a lot of discussions about like what exactly that means, where we're getting the funding from. I think, a big place to start is diminishing or eliminating, the education cross subsidies. That's something that the state has talked about for a long time. But I also know there's, we have a DFL trifecta, we have a large surplus this year, so I think there's also some appetite to make some other big changes, so I've heard a lot about class size caps. I think that that's, incredibly important. We know that being able to get like individualized support from teachers is really what can help push our young people forward. Something that I care really deeply about is the ethnic studies bill. So making ethnic studies a graduation requirement for all high school students in Minnesota. As a former public school student, of color, I know how meaningful it is to be able to see yourself in the curriculum, and how many young people in our communities just don't have that opportunity, right? I'm a fourth generation Japanese American. My family was interned during World War II, along with 120,000 other Japanese Americans. And that's a history that I wasn't taught in school, right? That's a history that lives on as legacy in my family, but is really unknown to a lot of people. So, I think it's both the opportunity for students of color to see themselves reflected, but it's also the opportunity for all Minnesota students to be able to learn American history, right? And learn honest and accurate representations of U.S. history. So I think there's the funding piece, there's the curriculum piece, and then there's also just the teaching piece, right? We know that in so many of our care systems, we have incredible workforce shortages, incredible workforce issues. And with our teachers, we're seeing that too, right? We are seeing a mass exodus from the classroom. And that means that the folks that are still there are just holding, so much more. And so how are we stepping up for our teachers? How are we bringing other folks into the building to support them? Mental health for young people is definitely a huge thing that I heard about when I was talking to folks in my community. A lot of, just heartbreaking stories about the real mental health needs of young people. And so can we get them those services in schools to help them, be able to learn better? I think that's really important too.
And just finally, from your campaign webpage, I saw you said, now is the time for us to tap into our political imagination. What does that mean, and how can that be done?
I wrote that before the results of the election,
yeah,
right?
sure.
And so I would say that statement is even more true right now, right? I think that, so much of the time we, when we're making policies, when we're in these institutions, we can really feel boxed in by what was done before, right? By the kind of the confines of what has been possible. And I think, a moment for me like 2020 where we were having some real kind of eye-opening discussions, right, about like what would a public safety system look like that actually kept everyone safe, helped me kind of think bigger, think broader, think bolder. And I think, now is the time to do that with the trifecta, with the surplus. I would say also, I've been working with young people for 11 years, and young people just have an amazing ability to have a broader imagination, right? Because they're not as kind of confined of, prior ways of doing things, of the status quo. And so, from working with young people, seeing their activism, I know that I've been, really pushed forward. I think one area in particular where I really see that is climate change, right? And I would say I'm 33, and I feel like people 20 years younger than me are leading me in that area, right? Are leading with clarity, leading with urgency on that issue that, maybe folks of my generation and older find a little bit harder to do, right? Like the idea of not owning a car, right? And living in a society that's less car-centric, like as someone who grew up driving, that's harder for me, right? But there's a lot of young people I know who are like, that's the way of the future, like, come on, yeah. And let's get there. And so I feel like one of my roles, stepping into the legislature and my previous background working with young people is really just to take their message and try to amplify it and turn it into policy, because they absolutely do have that political imagination, and I just need to kind of follow that.